Hi everybody and welcome back to Sheroes of History. Today I've got another story of an incredible historical heroine for you. I'm going to be talking about Murasaki Shikibu, who was the author of what most people consider to be the first ever novel. Murasaki Shikibu was born in Japan in the 10th century. It's a very long time ago for us now, over 1,000 years ago. As she was growing up, she learnt from her granddad and her dad, who were both poets and writers. They loved to read and they loved to write, and she really wanted to be just like them. Now, unfortunately for Murasaki, in Japan at that time, girls weren't allowed to learn to read and write. Although she was in Japan, this is a little bit confusing. Actually, what the men would read and write in, the language they would use was Chinese, and girls specifically weren't allowed to learn Chinese. Now, luckily for Murasaki, she had a brother, and so what she would do is sit at the back of his lessons when he was learning Chinese, and she would try and learn too. And she was a really clever young girl, and she picked it up really fast. So she was able to start writing her own poems from a very young age. When she grew up a little bit, she was sent to live at the palace to be friends with the princess who lived there. So she was sort of like a servant to the princess, sort of like a friend. And once she started living at the palace, she decided to write down what it was like. So she started a diary. And actually you can still read her diary today because it was actually published many years after her death. In her diary, she wrote all about what it was like living in a palace and being near a princess. And she also said that most people thought she was a little bit lonely, and that's only because she loved reading so much that she always just used to go to her bedroom to read her books, maybe to write things down, and she really just loved being on her own and reading. And certainly I think there's lots of us who know exactly why she loved that so much. I think she was a little bit of a bookworm, really. Now, remember I said that the girls weren't allowed really to learn how to read and write in Chinese. Because she was really good friends with the princess, one day the princess asked about the Chinese language, and because Murasaki knew how to write it, she secretly started to teach the princess how to read and write in Chinese as well. They had to keep it secret because no one was meant to know that the girls were also learning Chinese. Now, it probably would have stayed a secret, apart from the fact that the princess decided to redecorate her bedroom. And what did she paint on the walls? She painted some Chinese writing. And as soon as everybody saw her writing in Chinese, they were shocked. And they didn't know how she had learned how to do it. Luckily, they didn't find out that it was Murasaki that had taught her, so she was able to get away with it. Now, throughout this time when she was living at the palace, as well as keeping her diary, she started to write a story. And it was a story about a prince called Genji. Lots of bits of the story sounded quite a lot like life at the palace that she'd experienced. And every day, as she went back to her bedroom in the evening, maybe she'd do a little bit of reading, but sometimes she would sit down and she would write a bit more of her book. Eventually, the book came out. It had taken her 10 years to write, but when it did come out, it was a huge success. Everybody loved it. It was called The Tale of Genji, and it became one of the most famous books that had ever been written. And actually it's still famous even now. People today say that it was the first story written down in a book, the first novel, and people still study it for how brilliant it is. Now, one more thing which is interesting to know about Murasaki Shikibu is that that's actually not her real name. Nobody knows what her name actually is. In those days in Japan, when children were born, they would only bother to write down the name if it was a boy. So nobody knows what her real name was, and actually the name Murasaki Shikibu was one of the characters from her book, The Tale of Genji. I hope you've enjoyed this story and learning a little bit more about another Shero of History. If you have, please do go and check out the Sheroes of History blog at sheroesofhistory.wordpress.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at Sheroes History and like us on Facebook. And of course, if there's a Shero you really think everyone needs to know about, you can write for the blog as well. There's a form on there that you can fill out and it will come through to me. And if you want to, you could write about a woman that's inspired you and it will appear on the blog. Thanks ever so much, everybody. Take care. Bye.